Hi everybody, welcome back to Middle of Apologetics. My name is Stephen Witzik. Glad to be with you here today. Hope you've been able to follow along the last three videos. This is fourth part of dealing with Daniel Rogers' book, The Last Enemy, The Triumph of Christ. And in the book, of course, he is arguing about the death of Adam and what that is. And we've explained and we've talked a little bit about the idea that the full preterist has to hold to the idea that the death of Adam is spiritual death, and that is the death that Christ experienced on the cross. His physical death was an outside kind of not the real thing, the real point is he had to die spiritually on the cross in order to atone for the death that we experience. And that just kind of flies in the face of real theology. So we've talked about in the last few videos about death and what is the four deaths, and that Rogers theologically did not understand that the Bible talks of four, not two. He only claimed that there was physical and spiritual death, but the Bible also talks about the lake of fire being the second death and death by punishment for sin. So now, carrying on to his next argument in the book, what he wants to prove is that death existed in the garden beforehand. And as we laid out real simply before, that God is not going to pronounce a judgment of death on somebody who is already going to die. In Genesis 3, cursed is the ground because of you, so the ground is cursed, creation is cursed. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. It means you're going to have to suffer. Making your own food now, and it's just not going to grow up. You're going to have to plant fields and do all those things. And thorns and thistles it shall bring forth you. Do we have thorns and thistles? Yeah, we do. So that hasn't been reversed. And you shall eat the plants of the field. Okay. Corn, wheat, barley, rye. All right, there you go. And so by the sweat of your face, you'll have to work it. You shall eat bread. So we have to grow the grain, harvest it, make bread. Has been going on for centuries since then. Before that, it was the trees just naturally produce the fruit and everybody can go in there, eat it, and say, hey, that's wonderful. So, by the sweat of your face you shall eat it till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So we established that death is a result of the curse, mortality. See, mortal means subject to death. Immortal means no longer subject to death. The body here, turning to dust, is talking about the body being turned to dust. Not the spirit, but the body turning to dust. And that is a pronouncement of a physical death. And we explained, of course, then, also in that last video, that no, they did not die that day. An animal died in their place. The Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. The animal died, and they were covered over. Their sin and their nakedness was covered over by the animal's skins, who died in their place. That is the heart and the soul of the sacrificial system. It's easy to do. So, in his next argument, he says, notice that physical death was created by God as a natural process. Okay, let's look at his argument against that natural, as a natural process, meaning that he's saying that the natural process was part of the creation already, so therefore God could not be pronouncing on Adam natural death. But we just proved, and this is what he doesn't deal with, of course, is turning to dust. It's physical death. It's a pronouncement of, you don't say and argue that, oh, you did something wrong, I'm going to kill you for it. But the person was already going to die anyway. So now you're telling him, well, you're going to die for doing that, but I was already going to die. So what kind of a punishment is that? Doesn't make any sense. That, yeah, you'll live out your 80, 90 years or whatever it is, and then you will die. Hey, I was already going to do that. So why is that a curse? It's not. That's not logical. People, that's inconsistent. That is the glaring mistake of full preterism. I don't know how to make it any more stronger of a point. to declare that their death existed in the garden, that Adam was created from dust, so therefore he was all going to turn to dust anyway. So when he sinned, God declared to him, you're going to turn to dust. Sorry, it doesn't make any sense. We already know that separation of the body from the spirit is what is death. So what he argues is this: and the earth brought forth grass and herb and yield and seeds according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed in itself according to its own kind. And God saw that it was good. Okay, now here's his argument. He brings up that seeds, right? Tree, field. So in other words, the fruit in the garden, they would drop their fruit, the seeds would grow, and they would grow up to be another tree. And then later on, that tree would, of course, would naturally grow old and eventually die, and so the new tree would take over. This is what he's implying by that. So and he says, in order for a seed to produce fruit, what needs to happen to the seed? Well, foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies. Now he's quoting 1 Corinthians 15:36, and he's saying the seed has to die. Well, that means the seed came off the tree, it fell into the ground, it died, and therefore life came from it. Therefore, death existed in the garden. Wow. But then yet he explained also that death is the separation of the body and the spirit. So, are you telling me a tree and a fruit has a body and a spirit? And then, of course, he bases this all on his biblical knowledge without going to the Greek. And I've already demonstrated that Ma'at surely be put to death from the Hebrew that he ignores. And because he won't go to that, he won't understand what that really death is talking about, surely death. So here he is again talking about death and the seed. The word for death, of course, is thanatos. That is the most common Greek word used for it. Ma'at, surely die, death. The word, though, when it talks about in this verse in 1 Corinthians 15:36, the word death there is apanthoniska. Stresses the ending of what is former to bring about what naturally follows. In other words, like a caterpillar, it's got this one form, it goes into the cocoon, and what comes out is the butterfly itself. The caterpillar produced the cocoon. It changes, it morphed into something else. So what it was old form was, it died and became something else in that sense. That is what the word is stressing, the ending of what is former, to bring about what naturally follows. It's not talking about death. Death is ceasing to exist. If I squash the butterfly, it no longer exists. It cannot morph and become something else. If I kill the caterpillar, I step on it and squish it, it's dead. It cannot go and make the cocoon and become a butterfly. I ended its life. And so the death that he's talking about, the seed, is not the ending of its life, that where it ceases to be and to exist. See, that's where the theology and the Greek comes into play. And when you form a theology, you have to go with the understanding of what the word is talking about. He doesn't do that. Second, of course, we brought up the contradiction in the belief that the life of the body is in the blood. The shedding of blood ends the life. So a seed is not experiencing death, but the transition from one former form to the new. It is a continuing of the seed's life. If the blood is shed, then the life ceases to exist in the body. But seeds have no blood to shed, nor is there a spirit that leaves the body. So, of course, if James says that death is the body and the spirit separating, then that is what death is. The life of the animal is in the blood. If the blood ceases to flow and it ends, or it's shed, that it dies. For the life of every creature is in its blood. Its blood is its life. Therefore I have said to the people of it, you shall not eat the blood of any creature, for the life of every creature is in its blood, and whoever eats it shall be not cut off. He never said the life of the tree is in its blood, or any other such thing of plants and animals. He gave them for them to eat. So you would have to imply that also that I pluck an apple from the tree. So the minute I took the apple from the thing, it died. See, that doesn't make sense. Or if I cut down a tree, does that mean I killed its life and now I'm guilty of shedding its blood? No, there's no prohibition of chopping down a tree, or in the sense that it's being defined as being killed. So let's go on to something else here. Fingernails are created from dead cells, and they push out. Your hair is dead cells that are being pushed out. So does that mean death existed in the garden? Or what kind of death is actually he's talking about? Because see, even the death of the fingernail that creates a fingernail, that's death. But that is changing from one form to another form. Do you see how that continues on? My hair, it grows out. The death of those cells pushes out. Hair is dead, it is not alive. But that does not mean death existed in the garden. So because he wrongly defines what physical death, he concludes that there was a natural death process in the garden based on those two arguments. And then what does he say after that? So if physical death was part of creation, yes, it was good. Now, do you see that logic there? Because God pronounced everything that he created in the garden as being good. And so he says now that death was created in the garden as part of the natural process, therefore it was good. And yet, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, the last enemy is death. And of course, you want to wrongly define that as being spiritual death, but we've already proven that the death threatened in the garden was to be punished for sin and for a person to physically die. And the result of the curse was for a person to physically die. Therefore, death is an enemy of God, the last enemy to be killed. So let's make another little distinction here in a theological point that is kind of missed, and we'll end it with this. People, spiritual death ends and is defeated at the cross. When a person becomes born again, they become, Paul says, they are a new creation in Christ. They have been born again. Their spirit has been regenerated, and that means to be made alive in Christ. Their life now that they have is found in Christ, who has made them to be alive, not dead. Do we understand that? So in the resurrection of 1 Corinthians, he says, what? They come to life. The last enemy is physical death. Well, what was physical death? Is that the first death that you were freed from? Or is that the last? You can't tell me that Christ died for and to get rid of and to remove physical death. Because that is true, then of course, then the last enemy is not physical death, it's the first enemy. But he calls it the last enemy. So if physical death is the last enemy, then we're talking about at one point, physical death will end. Not spiritual death, physical death. Spiritual death was the first thing conquered on the cross. So therefore, the last enemy to be defeated is physical death. He also argues, I want to bring this out here, Adam and Eve had to eat to stay alive. So therefore, he's going to argue, Adam and Eve, well, they put food in the garden, so therefore they have to eat it, or they would have died. So that proves that there was mortal death and they were subject to death in the garden. Let me point out something. In the new heavens and the earth, we also see the tree of life, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations. And that tree is part of the city. So in the new heavens and the new earth, when they come down out of heaven, or let's just say we stay in heaven and that's where the end. Are you going to say the tree's not there? Why do we assume that because there's a tree and it's seen in heaven, in the heavenly Jerusalem, that it demands that the people need to eat in order to stay alive? Let's make this real clear. Wow. I'm baffled by some of this, but it says the heavens declare the handiwork of God. The smells of the flower are there for man's pleasure. Animals are there for his pleasure, for man's pleasure. He was to rule over the animals. The sights and sounds that are all created for the pleasure of man, that somehow now you're going to say food cannot be pleasure to enjoy. That Adam and Eve can enjoy the sights and the sounds and the touch and the feel of animals, and the idea of Adam being able to wrestle with a bear and all of those different things. He can enjoy all that. And then God made all these fruit and vegetables, and he tells them to eat. And you have to eat of that so that you don't die. Does that make any sense? How about the idea that taste is the same thing as the other things? The sight, sound, smell, touch, taste. We're all about the enjoying of something in the senses that God created for our enjoyment, and had nothing to do with having to eat to stay alive. Far from it. Far from it. If he put all those things in the garden for us to enjoy, man was made immortal, sinned and lost that mortality and becomes immortality and becomes mortal. There's that transition that happens. You have to say that food was not the point to stay alive. That is simply no basis for that whatsoever. And maybe the last point I bring up here very quickly so we can end this is that in the restitution of all things, we are not returning back to the state of Adam after the fall. We are returning to the state, the restitution of what it was like in the garden before the fall, before the curse. So if the curse is part of creation and affects man's life, the birth process of having to go through pain to give birth and all things, then the restoration of all things is the return to the conditions before the fall. Then that means there would have not been death in the garden. There would not have been thorns and thistles growing up in the garden. There would not have been pain in childbearing. All of those things would have not have happened because they are pronounced as part of the curse that is placed on man. Therefore, they did not exist beforehand. They have to exist after. That's common logic. Everything that he created was good in the garden. Death cannot be considered good because it came as a result of the curse, not as a natural process. I hope you're catching the power of that and understanding those things as I lay them out. Again, if I'm not making myself real clear, I'm trying to repeat it, say it in different ways so that it could be understood. Please comment, say something below, and let me know. And we'll try to work on it in a better way if we can. So again, I will catch you on the flip-flop side, and appreciate you listening, subscribing, and sharing this with other people. And I'm keeping this short point so that full preterists, when they read this and listen to it, they address the points that are being made. I know preterists are reading this, but they're not addressing the points. They come back. I don't see any refutation. I don't see any rebuttal to what I'm saying. I'm not understanding why, if they want to believe that death exists in the garden, can you prove to me why death existed before the garden, before the fall, why God would curse them with death, giving them death afterwards if they already had it? How is that wrong? So I look forward to the answers and everything else. Pass this on, and